Indie classics like Hotline Miami, Super Meat Boy, and Fly Wrench hit hard by having really short levels, so I thought it would be fun to push that to the extreme and make a game where each level only takes half a second. And after showing the final game to some friends, I think I did a pretty good job. My development process for this game had 5 parts: ideation, prototype, visuals, level design, and then the final polish. I thought the most important thing to get right with this concept was to make sure the player could actually express themselves in the time limit, so I dismissed keyboard input and focused only on mouse movement. I felt this would allow for a greater range of movement possibilities. I ended up not regretting that decision at all. Next, I thought about how the more complex the mechanics of a game are, the more time you need to give players in order to actually make an action. Otherwise, they get overwhelmed and stop making informed decisions. With this in mind, I figured that because I was committing to extremely short levels, the goal and mechanics in each level needs to be as simple as physically possible. I landed on this. For each level, all you have to do is move the cursor from the starting blue square to the green ending square, without colliding with any of the red squares. Easy. But perhaps a little bit too difficult? To give the players a fighting chance, before the level starts, they'll see all the level objects in silhouette, with their colours only being revealed when the level starts. I really wanted to have moments in this game where the player has to change plans within that 0.5 second window. I also planned to randomise which squares were a goal or an enemy, so you'd still need to react in the moment, even if you'd played the level before. Overall, it's an extremely simple design, maybe even too simple, but for a game I wanted to get done in a couple days, I think this is fine. My general rule for prototyping is to get the input method in first, so for player movement I just used a simple raycast forward from the mouse position through the camera and onto the background game object. Then I moved my character to where the raycast hit the background. I also decided to change the design here a little bit. Instead of just moving the cursor, you have to pick up the blue object and make it hit the green object. That felt more satisfying, and I saw potential of how it could impact gameplay later. Next, I made one script to handle what happens when the mouse hovers over different objects. But I found an issue here where if I'd moved my mouse too fast, the raycast would just skip over the collider. I used a different method of detecting collision by using the 2D colliders, but that didn't work either for the same root reason. The mouse moves too fast and the colliders never actually overlap. The final thing I did was use a line cast, which instead of detecting if a collider is at the end of a line, detects if there is a collider between 2 points. Those 2 points being the mouse position of the last frame and of the current frame, so even though the player has technically gone past the enemy, if there was a hit, then I can just move them back. I kept the 2D overlapping logic though, because I found there's some edge cases where that's actually helpful. Next, I created a script to handle all the boilerplate game logic stuff: winning, losing, loading levels, that sort of thing. All those functions are triggered by the interactable object script, which is on nearly every gameplay relevant object in the game, and each takes an enum that dictates what they look like and what happens when they're collided with. This allows me to switch the type of each object whenever I want during gameplay, which I did so I could fulfill that randomization idea I wanted. Designing the meta structure for the levels was interesting. It initially worked so that whenever a new level needed to be loaded, I picked a new one randomly from all the levels you haven't completed yet, meaning that the game is constantly throwing new stuff at you and you can't rely on muscle memory as much. After testing this out a bit, I found the results made the pacing of the game a little too random, so I made it so the next level is picked from a small pool of levels, with more difficult levels being added as you progress. Lastly, when you complete all the levels, I added an end screen which shows you how long it took you to do that. Now that the foundations of the game were done, I moved on to getting the visuals looking good. I've been on a real kick recently of just embracing Comic Sans as part of my aesthetic, so I imported that from another project and just applied it to all the UI. Fuck the haters. I know I didn't want to make the art too busy, so I just made the main body of each obstacle a simple rectangle with a small bevel with thick outlines, which I kind of knew wouldn't look interesting enough on its own, so I made a system for adding faces to each block, making them look sad when you lose, happy when you win, angry when you hit them, etc, etc. I also added a small drop shadow to all the characters to give the scene a tiny sense of depth. I also coded the background color to change depending on the current game state. Lastly, for visuals, I added an animation which fades the levels in and out when the levels change, so that didn't feel so bad. That made the visuals look about done, so I moved on to audio. With my last two games, I've only used mouth sounds for almost all the sound effects and music, partly because it's quick, but also because it feels like it works with my doodly art style. To get that working, I just imported my sound system I copied from Brackeys like 5 years ago. If it isn't broke, right? How the music works is a little bit unique. I wanted 2 different tracks for the planning stage and acting stage of a level, but if I replayed each track from the start every time I switched, it would get very repetitive. So I actually have both tracks play at the same time, but switch which one is currently at max volume. I feel like the world's most basic DJ. With all that done, I moved on to actually making content. So after making a few levels with the foundational elements, I made a quick list of ideas for level mechanics that I thought would be cool. I had about 10 ideas I was quite excited for, but I was running out of time, so I just picked the easiest mechanic to implement and that I thought would be fun. That mechanic was the ability for blocks to move around and rotate when the level starts, which to implement just meant importing LeanTween into the project and calling in their built-in functions whenever I wanted an object to move a certain way. When I was designing levels for this, I thought it was a little bit unfair when a block would move without any prior warning, so I made it so that the face of each block is adjusted slightly to hint at the direction it's going to go when the level starts. My hope is that this rewards observant people. I did this by getting the end position of the tween, subtracting that from the current position, and then normalizing that value, which constrains the values of that vector 3 between -1 and 1, while still retaining the direction of that vector. Multiplying that value allows me to move the face closer or further away from that end position, so I only multiplied it by a small amount to get the desired effect. I then spent some time adding a small editor script to the project, which allows me to click a button and fix a bunch of values. You'll notice that the past 2 things I explained weren't exactly gameplay mechanics, and you're right, I was getting distracted. Level design is always a place in game development where I can't help but drag my feet. Coding is like sculpting some perfect statue out of marble. You can just spend all day making it perfect. Level design, though, is like writing. You're constantly thinking about what the player is actually experiencing at any given time, and that's just really draining and makes me want to throw up. I found the best way for me to get over this hump is to write all the level ideas down on paper first, then just go into a fugue state and try to make it all in Unity as quickly as possible. Once that's done, I find editing the levels to be a lot easier. Right as I started to move into the final polish stage of development, I tested my levels a few more times and found that my collision detection still wasn't good enough. Something about those line casts just wasn't doing the job, which sort of made me panic a little bit, because if that's not right, then like the whole integrity of the game is a little bit in question, right? The solution I came up with was a mix of the raycast and linecast techniques. I take the location of the mouse last frame and then also on the current frame, then use a loop function to get a bunch of the positions in between those 2 points. Then I check if any of those positions are inside the bounds of a collider. I initially tried doing that with raycasts, but that didn't work. Looks cool though. It's still not perfect. Maybe it would be better if I went back and fixed the linecast system, or look into sphere casts. But I don't know, maybe the current system could lead to some cool speedrunning tech, I don't know. I just need to get this thing done. Anyway, the final touches to this project were to record a bunch of different sounds for when you hit an obstacle to stop it getting too samey. Then I cleaned up the UI, added some portraits to the start and end screen, and then reordered the levels a bit. And I was done. Ta-da! Finally, I could show it to some friends and get some feedback. To do that, I took the game to a real-life playtest event at this bar. Feedback was mostly positive. The main issues were just the collision still being unreliable in places. There were also a couple levels which were way too difficult, but also kind of boring, so I had to address that in an update. As far as this project goes, I think this is a good place to stop for now, even though there's a lot more things I would change. As of now, the game is available on itch.io and Newgrounds, links are in the description. If you have any comments or criticisms, leave them in the comments here. Subscribe if you want to help me make more things. Thanks for watching.